I'm Laura Lucas Magnuson, and this is The World Unpacked.
A new warning tonight about the scope of a massive cyber attack.
Already believed to be the largest cyber attack on our government.
America under virtual invasion. That's what Senator Dick Durbin is calling a massive Russian cyber attack on U.S. government agencies.
A so-called
Microsoft is said to have been hacked as part of a suspected Russian campaign that's hit several U.S. government agencies, including the National Nuclear Security Administration. Sources say the attack took advantage of the widespread use of software from a company called SolarWinds.
Now let's get the details. Disruptions at gas stations across the Southeast as a critical pipeline remains shut down due to a cyber attack. Huge lines formed across multiple states yesterday as panicked Americans started a run on gas. According to
cyber attack and rising gas prices have put more pressure on President Biden to take action, and he has issued a new executive order to help protect against future attacks. Senior White House.
My administration is also committed to safeguarding our critical infrastructure, much of which is privately owned, and private entities are making their own determination on cybersecurity. So to jumpstart greater investment in cybersecurity, we launched a new public-private initiative in April.
Facebook forbidden still for the former president for now, but the company's independent oversight board is kicking the ultimate decision back to Facebook, saying the platform's indefinite suspension of Donald Trump's account in the aftermath of the January 6th insurrection is not appropriate, and giving a 6-month window for Facebook to clarify its rules and decide what to do. Put a concrete timeline on.
Last week saw skyrocketing gas prices at pumps across the eastern United States as drivers grew concerned by a cyber attack on the Colonial Pipeline. In December, Russian-backed hackers gained access to thousands of federal government and private company accounts after breaking into a software company called SolarWinds. And recently, the Facebook Oversight Board confirmed President Trump's ban from the platform. What do ransomware attacks, nation-state hacks, and Facebook bans have in common? A thorny set of governance gaps, changing norms, and complex multi-stakeholder structures. With me today is Jon Bateman, a fellow in the Cyber Policy Initiative at Carnegie. A former intelligence analyst, Jon previously worked on cyber issues in the Department of Defense. He worked closely with the former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Joseph Dunford Jr. Today we'll unpack the most pressing cyber and tech concerns and the challenges of establishing norms and a unified tech governance strategy. Welcome, Jon.
Thanks for having me.
So, Jon, first I want to cover the recent Colonial Pipeline hack from the other weekend that has spilled over into recent days. You know, over the last week, we've seen news, and perhaps even some of our listeners, myself included, actually, have personally experienced long lines and empty gas stations. While other major cyber attacks have compromised online accounts, this recent pipeline hack may have been the one that illustrated most viscerally and perhaps even frightening images of the destructive potential of cyber attacks. Can you briefly recap what happened and who was responsible?
Well, Laura, let me just say I also, like you, was affected by this hack. I had to drive out of town to get gas this weekend, and it took me about half an hour waiting in line to get gas. So I'm sure a lot of Americans have been personally affected by this cyber incident, which isn't unusual, right? And it kind of brings home the significance of these events. So let me just say that what we know right now is based on what's been put out into the public domain through company statements and reporting. So some of this may evolve over time as the investigation continues. But essentially, Colonial Pipeline, the largest U.S. petroleum pipeline, was the victim of a ransomware attack. And for listeners who don't know, ransomware is where cyber criminals get inside your network and essentially lock up your data and hold it hostage. So they encrypt it, and you can't get access to it unless you pay them some fee, usually in cryptocurrency. So what happened then is that this attack actually did not immediately affect the pipeline itself. It affected Colonial's back office IT systems, the kind of computers that the administrators are running. But the pipeline was concerned that this could have spread farther in the networks. They didn't know. So the company shut down the actual pipeline operations out of an abundance of caution. That then led to some difficulties getting gas around the country, and of course, panic buying by consumers, which contributed to shortages and high prices. I mentioned both of these things, the fact that they shut down the pipeline out of an abundance of caution and this panic buying, to show how there's can often be cascading consequences, right? Something that initially happened one network then expanded well beyond that. And that then had a ripple effect on other people's behavior, causing far greater damage than was originally anticipated. The group that was responsible for this is a ransomware franchise called DarkSide. And viewers or listeners may not understand that a lot of these ransomware gangs have pretty complex business models. You may have one group of people that penetrates a company's network, another group of people that exploits that network and installs the ransomware, and maybe a third group of people that does what they consider to be customer service, which is negotiating the ransom payment. So DarkSide is almost like the McDonald's of ransomware in that they actually have affiliates that go out and help them perform these kinds of attacks.
I'm trying to wrap my brain around the idea of a franchise model, but you've explained it pretty well. So, Colonial Pipeline did, in fact, give in to the demands of the attackers and paid off reportedly nearly $5 million in ransom. Do you have concern, or is there concern among experts about whether the ransom should have been paid? And what are the dangers of leaving these kinds of really complicated decisions to private companies that actually have, as you mentioned, big public impacts?
Well, no company in this situation has good choices available, right? Ideally, you would have already protected your network or backed up your data. But if you find yourself in a situation where you don't, then you have to choose whether or not to pay. And paying a ransom is, what economists would consider to be your classic externality, right? It may benefit you, the victim, because it's cheaper than suffering the consequences of losing that data. And yet by paying, you're ensuring that ransomware is a profitable enterprise. And that helps fund the next round of attacks on other organizations. This is almost like a form of polluting, which is typically where the government might get involved and regulate some of this activity. I just want to pause here for a moment on this notion that the decision of whether to pay a ransom is typically left up to private companies. You've heard President Biden, emphasize that Colonial is a private company. His administration has said they're responsible for their own cybersecurity. Frankly, a lot of Americans might find this kind of bewildering, considering that this pipeline is a critical national security and economic asset. And when it goes down, the entire eastern half of the country is somewhat paralyzed, right? So this just vividly illustrates the externality problem in cyberspace and the fact that there's a lot of problems like this, and the public-private distinction is sometimes kind of untenable. So right now, experts are having a lively debate about whether there should be some kind of restrictions or bans on ransomware payments. I already gave the argument for why there should be a ban. It might actually reduce the volume of attacks. Now, there's lots of good arguments against a ban too, including that it just would be ineffectual, right? Because even if some companies are not going to pay due to the payment ban, some companies and victims still would be paying under the table. And ransomware is so cheap to operationalize that it would continue. So there really is not a consensus among experts at this point, but at least people are saying we need to get more of a sense of the problem, collect better data, and have better public-private information sharing.
Jon, you've written a lot on the growing market for cyber insurance. Can you explain to our listeners the significance of this and how it connects to issues like the Colonial Pipeline?
Sure. Yeah, so people might not realize that companies can actually buy insurance to cover the damage that might occur in an event like a ransomware attack. Now, the details of this are complicated, what exactly is and isn't covered by cyber insurance and when you can use it, at what levels. But just like other forms of risk, insurance can be very beneficial to the companies purchasing it. It can help them kind of manage and smooth their risk. And also they buy access to expertise like incident response services in the case of a major event. But what I've written about is how cyber insurance can have a broader benefit to society as a whole, not just the companies buying and selling it. If you think about it, historically, insurance has functioned as a kind of soft regulator where they can wield carrots and sticks in the marketplace to improve the behavior of the insured companies, in this case, around cyber risk. So an insurance company could say to a client that they're going to charge higher premiums to clients with poor cybersecurity practices. Or if there's an incident, they could reduce the amount that they're paying for a claim where the company itself was negligent in contributing to that incident. Insurance companies also have wide visibility across a range of clients, so they can sometimes be the first ones to identify systemic forms of cyber risk and call attention to how they could be fixed. Now, that's a kind of idealized version of what cyber insurance could do. The truth is that we're far from realizing this potential today. Cyber insurance is still too small of a market, and the economics of it remain very uncertain, just how exactly this could all function. But what this example shows is that we can and must create private sector forms of governance to fill the gaps in what governments themselves can do, right? So if President Biden is saying he can only do so much to prevent the next Colonial Pipeline cyber attack, then we need other institutional models to come in and bolster that. And insurance could be one of those.
President Biden has said that the Russian government was not involved in this hack, but that the hackers appear to be living in Russia. What level of culpability does Moscow have for this event, should they have? And should the United States try to hold other countries accountable for cyber criminals operating inside their territory?
Yeah, so thinking about state culpability for cyber incidents, it's more of a spectrum than a binary on-off switch. People often seem to be preoccupied with the question of, did President Putin personally order a cyber attack or a hack? And there are cases where we know that he did. And this is not one of those. But that's hardly the end of the story, because there are many other ways in which states cultivate or encourage or tolerate major cyber attacks. So thinking about Russia in particular, cybercrime in Russia, I would really think about it as a state-sanctioned enterprise or even a regulated sector of the Russian economy, right? So Russia has a national policy whereby they choose to permit cyber criminals to operate relatively freely from their territory. This means Russia generally does not prosecute Russian cyber criminals. And when other countries seek to prosecute them, Russia can take sometimes aggressive steps to prevent their extradition. Now, this is a double-edged sword. In return, Russia then places certain requirements on these criminals. They're not allowed to hack Russian targets or other former Soviet states, and they must be available for tasking by the Russian state when needed, whether in the case of an intelligence operation through cyberspace or cyber war. And there's documented cases of both of these things happening. So in my view, it makes more sense to think about Russian-based cybercrime as a kind of parastatal element. It's a co-opted part of the Russian state. And let me just say, Russia is not the only country with an arrangement somewhat like this, although they vary from country to country. So the bottom line is that, yes, the United States does need to try to hold foreign countries accountable in these types of situations for the various level of tolerances or support that governments have towards cybercrime ecosystems. Now, how to actually do that is a really complicated question, but that needs to be the goal.
I mean, your answer also, reminds me that even the words we use are really complicated here, right? Cyber attack, hack, incident. It's in part because it's on the spectrum of what would be considered an attack, what's an incident, what's a crime. Very complex. In this case in SolarWinds, if we get back to that, it looks like a more clearly state-sponsored operation that compromised software that's widely used in many companies and organizations and the government, which may well have been the target. And from a governance perspective, how do you think the government and private sector worked well in this particular incident or not? And maybe recap it for our audience who hasn't followed the SolarWinds incident so closely.
So the SolarWinds hack was a recent incident whereby Russian intelligence services compromised an American software company called SolarWinds, which is not a household name, but they are very important because they provide critical IT management services and software to many, many major organizations and government networks. And this was a supply chain operation whereby the Russian hackers were able to compromise the system by which SolarWinds pushes out software updates, so that then when a future software update was pushed out to these customers, it had malware in place and created a backdoor for the Russians. Now, Laura, you asked about the public-private interface here. And I think it's interesting that when this hack was disclosed, it was widely reported that senior US government national security officials really weren't even familiar with SolarWinds or its place in the digital ecosystem. This is the kind of software that was more recognizable to, CIOs and kind of back office IT professionals. And I just want to say that I consider this to be a really serious problem, right? If you are the president sitting in the Oval Office after an event like this, you may want to go to your government and say, I need a list of all of the most critical software out there that, if compromised, could have an outsized effect on the economy, on state and local governments, on the federal government. And it just doesn't seem like we have a list like that right now, which is problematic because SolarWinds illustrates that there are pockets of criticality throughout the digital ecosystem that often are invisible to us and are changing from time to time, right? So Zoom now is critical infrastructure, didn't used to be, right? So Biden's recent executive order is putting some initial pieces in place to begin to address this problem, defining the term critical software and seeking to think about what kinds of requirements or support critical software might need in the economy. But this is going to be a very long-term challenge.
And we'll be right back to discuss the growing challenges of governance in tech. Jon, I now want to switch gears a little bit. About a week ago or so, the Facebook Oversight Board issued a ruling that upheld former President Trump's ban on Facebook. For listeners who might not be familiar with the Oversight Board, could you briefly describe the role of the institution and the significance of its establishment?
Sure. So, Facebook struggles with some really complicated decisions about what types of content should and shouldn't be allowed on its platform. And so for a long time, Facebook has talked about, is there some way to defer responsibility for these decisions onto some kind of outside body so that they're not just subject to relentless criticism from activists, governance users for every move that they make? And so in the absence of government regulation, what Facebook devised is this Oversight Board construct. And let me just say, the Oversight Board is a creation of Facebook, but it is in some ways independent. Facebook provided the funding and the mandate for this board and selected its initial members. But then the board is legally an independent entity that's not subject to interference from Facebook. And members of the board can actually then select additional members. So it's a somewhat of a self-sustaining body. And what this board is charged with doing is adjudicating cases about when Facebook either took down some content and that's disputed, or now when Facebook has chosen to leave up some content and that's disputed. And the Oversight Board is supposed to render a final judgment on this. And Facebook has promised to abide by these decisions. So let me just explain, though, some of the limitations of this construct. So Facebook isn't truly obligated to abide by the board's decisions forever. This is a promise that they've made that is revocable. This isn't a law. And the jurisdiction of the board is limited. It can only review individual decisions about specific content. So it doesn't look at, for example, the algorithms or the product design, a lot of what people consider to be the most important parts of Facebook's role in the information ecosystem. The board can only act in a piecemeal fashion, so one case at a time, rather than setting sweeping policy for Facebook. And it really doesn't have the tools to effectively monitor Facebook's compliance or force Facebook to provide detailed information. So in the end, this board doesn't exist to really set sweeping new standards for our online speech. It's really there just to adjudicate Facebook's own community standards.
It sounds a little bit like a Supreme Court of Facebook, which I guess it has been described, given those checks and balances and the independence, but not an ability to actually create policy. And it's one of the first of its kind in the tech space. Are there other similar regulatory bodies tied to other social media platforms like Twitter, Reddit, TikTok? Are there ideas for those if they're not yet established?
Right now, different platforms are all taking varying approaches to this. It's interesting that Facebook's original aspiration for this oversight board was that it would be a cross-platform body, but it couldn't actually get other platforms to sign up to it. That's actually why it's called simply the Oversight Board rather than the Facebook Oversight Board, right? Facebook still hopes that it could become a cross-platform model, but so far that hasn't happened. Let's take Twitter as an example. Twitter is taking a different approach. It continues to do in-house content moderation, but its long-term vision is a decentralized social media ecosystem whereby maybe my account and my content is not owned by any one platform, but that you can choose which platform to be on. And then all of these platforms are kind of interfacing with each other, right? So maybe I can tweet and then it would be seen on Facebook or Reddit or TikTok. They call this the blue sky model. And this is still in early development. But if you think about it, that's just a different approach to this same problem of how Twitter can somehow distribute or defer responsibility to these difficult decisions so that it's not the final arbiter and that it's more decentralized. Just the net result of all of this is that each company has a very distinct approach to content moderation right now. At Carnegie, we recently published some extensive quantitative research looking at the rule set, the community standards of 13 major platforms, what they ban, what they don't ban. And we found huge differences in even just the length of these documents. Twitter's community standards are twice as long as Facebook's. They're 100 times as long as Signal's. And there's varying differences in whether platforms are taking a more legalistic approach in which they define the kind of crimes or prohibitions in incredible detail, or if they're taking a more sweeping and general approach in which they use just a few words and kind of reserve to themselves discretion as to how they'll be enforced.
Well, hearing that, no wonder the public also gets confused about, the limitations and the different approaches of all of the different platforms. Going back to the Oversight Board, particularly, it only started its work in October 2020. Besides the upholding the Trump ban, have there been other key lessons learned from its decisions so far? And what actually has been the public reception?
Yeah, so it's been interesting to see the handful of initial decisions from the Oversight Board because they're trying to do a few things at once. On the one hand, they need to adjudicate the cases that they've selected and that Facebook has sent to them. But on the other hand, they also need to kind of publicly legitimate themselves and signal to the world and to various skeptical stakeholders about what kind of institution that they're going to be. And this is a kind of subtle set of maneuvers, right? A lot of people have been using the analogy of Marbury versus Madison, the famous U.S. Supreme Court decision in the court's very first term, where they defined for themselves what their role was going to be in American law. And so people are saying, is there going to be a Marbury moment for this Oversight Board? And it's unclear whether it's happened yet. But I've seen a couple major trends. First of all, generally setting aside the Trump decision, but even including that, the Oversight Board decisions have been fairly speech protective, right? So they're kind of erring on the side of requiring Facebook to leave up more content or more clearly spell out the rules for when they would ban content. And I think this is a little bit concerning to those of us who believe that Facebook and other social media companies are generally already too skewed in the direction of being a Wild West and allowing too much content online. The other thing that I've noticed is that the Oversight Board is seeking to kind of legalize this problem. They're pushing Facebook to have more and more explicit and detailed policies spelling out in exquisite specificity what would and wouldn't be allowed on the platform and what the consequences of that would be. And I think this is interesting because there are some real dilemmas here. On the one hand, that creates more accountability for platforms and more predictability for users. But on the other hand, very particularized rule sets can be cumbersome to operationalize, and it can create opportunities for bad actors to exploit the kind of edges and loopholes there. So I'm interested to see how this will develop and how the Oversight Board will continue to try to legitimate itself and prove its independence.
I'd like to tie all of this back to where we originally were discussing cybersecurity. Do you see similarities between structures like the Oversight Board and this insurance initiative that you were describing as ways that the private sector are working through how to handle tricky governance issues without resorting to government oversight or laws?
Absolutely. So let's just talk about the social media situation for a second, because we have a really complex governance problem there. On the one hand, nobody really wants platforms to be the final arbiters of speech, right? They have a huge power to set the terms of their of online discourse, but also they have perverse commercial incentives that are different from maybe the speech values that people have. They're not politically legitimated. They're not democratic organizations. And they don't even really have the capacity or the expertise to understand all of the philosophical, political, kinds of complexities of governing speech. So we don't want the platforms to be the final arbiters. But then who else would do it, right? Because we also don't want governments to be the final arbiters. In liberal democracies like the United States, we have a healthy skepticism of governments regulating speech. And in non-democracies, we already know that governments are abusing any authority they have to regulate speech. So the answer then is that we must develop some kind of hybrid approach that's neither giving all the power to the platforms nor all the power to governments. And so you can think about the Oversight Board as one attempt to do that, right? But in all likelihood, no single institution will be enough. Just like we see in cyberspace, insurance by itself won't be enough to solve the cybersecurity problem. So I foresee a future where we need to just have some kind of general balance of power amongst key stakeholders. You can think about those stakeholders as the platforms themselves, other commercial interests like advertisers, who are huge players in this space, governments, users, and civil society, right? Activists and others. We need to have some kind of situation where each of these institutions or communities has reasonable levers that they can use to hold the others in check. It doesn't seem like we're in that situation right now. It seems like platforms are probably overly powerful in this balance of power. So we're going to need to work on this balance over time. And this is probably going to take a really long time with a lot of stops and starts along the way.
And we'll discuss the role governments can play in internet governance when we come back. One of the biggest issues in tech governance is the global reach of multinational tech companies. Facebook, for example, has 2.8 billion users around the world. And so the power of these companies can sometimes rival that of nation states. What does this mean for governance of technology at an international level?
It's a great question, Laura. And let me just say, this is not a wholly new development. People have been thinking about the rise of multinational corporations for decades now. Whether it was a Nike or the United Fruit Company during the Cold War. But what is different today is that the rise of software and digital services companies like Facebook, Google, Amazon, and some of the largest, most powerful companies, they can operate without much of a physical presence in many countries. And to some extent, I think what's happening is that multinational tech companies are subsuming state-like functions, right? So this idea of being a speech gatekeeper and even deciding, for example, in the United States, we have campaign finance laws, right? Now, Facebook and Twitter have kind of created their own shadow campaign finance and disclosure regime, right? On top of that, where they have now instituted rules about when and how political candidates and others can advertise on their platforms and what kind of disclosures are required. So they're really starting to take on more of a role that states have historically had. And let me just go one step beyond that. Some of these companies are actually arrogating to themselves the power to oversee state activity. So, when governments speak on a tech company's platform, and Facebook chooses to remove President Trump from their platform, that is a kind of inversion of the typical power structure where now Facebook is regulating the US government. We saw a very vivid example of this week with the violence between Israel and Hamas. Facebook put out there that they actually had meetings with the Israeli defense minister and the Palestinian Authority about the information that was coming out of these territories and whether it was fomenting further violence or as being destabilizing. So this is really extraordinary when the Israeli defense minister will take a call with a Facebook executive to ensure that they're able to operate in the way that they want. There's other issues here about the economic value that's being extracted by these platforms. But I think fundamentally, the power of nation states is being very challenged around the world.
And how are governments reacting to the rise of these global tech companies? Where in particular does the United States stand, and how does the U.S. approach compare to other major countries?
There's been a big difference historically between the U.S. approach and other countries' approach for the basic reason that many of these multinational tech companies are based in the United States. So historically, the United States has welcomed these developments. Companies like Google, Facebook, and Apple were largely seen as projections of U.S. power and influence around the world, right? They were part of brand America. They reflected U.S. cultural and political values to an extent. And it was the United States that was capturing the economic gains of all of this activity. In other countries, these developments were seen in a much more jaundiced eye. And the way to capture this is what we call techno-nationalism. The rise of this notion that technology is a key facet in a kind of international competition between states, and states need to an extent claw back some of their sovereignty over technology. So we've seen countries like Germany impose new content regulation requirements on platforms. We've seen countries like India require tech companies to localize data within that country. We've seen France impose a new digital tax on foreign tech companies. And we've seen countries like Turkey impose new antitrust measures on foreign tech companies. So there's lots of different levers where countries around the world are trying to claw back some measure of digital sovereignty. And then, reluctantly, the United States has come around to this point of view as well. We're now at a stage clearly where most Americans are worried about the power of technology companies within our own society. And the US government is finally seeing these tech companies as basically pieces on a geopolitical and geoeconomic chessboard, especially vis-a-vis China. There is great concern that China is competing with the United States in a technology domain, and that we need to make sure that our companies are not only able to compete with Chinese companies, but are somehow aligned with a US government geopolitical strategy vis-a-vis China and others, and protected from potential espionage and subversion by China and other states. So there's been a lot of shifting ground in this territory.
Let's go back for a moment to cyber operations like the SolarWinds hack. That brings up another set of complicated governance issues because countries often disagree about what is acceptable or unacceptable behavior in cyberspace. Are there changing norms in this domain as well?
Yes and no. It's very complicated. Traditionally, many countries like the United States have sought to distinguish between espionage and attacks, meaning kind of targeted or intentional disruption or destruction. And most of the norms have focused on attacks, whereas the United States has traditionally taken the stance that national security espionage in the cyber domain is simply something that all states do, and that we do, we want to do, and we understand if other states do them, although we still might view it as friendly and we don't want it. What we're seeing with incidents like SolarWinds and prior incidents like the OPM hack is that there are now instances of cyber espionage that seem so large scale and potentially destabilizing that it's stretching the boundaries of whether cyber espionage truly can be seen as acceptable. And we're seeing similar concerns around influence operations and election interference, formerly not the major subject of norms, but now a huge US concern. So there's a couple ways that the US government can try to deal with this. One is to try to articulate new norms around cyber espionage that would say, okay, certain types of mass breaches of certain types of data, or of institutions where you could get on them and appear like you're stealing data, but later act to destroy them at the last minute. That could be destabilizing. We want a new norm around that. Now, we would then need to think, the United States government would need to think about what norms the US government is willing to live with, right? Because historically, the US government is one of the biggest perpetrators of mass cyber breaches. The other approach is just to say, you know what? Not everything needs to be a universal norm. Maybe we won't have norms in this space, but maybe that doesn't restrict the United States from still saying, well, SolarWinds was a very hostile act, and we are going to respond with sanctions, prosecutions, and basically push back with whatever power we have, whether or not there is a universally recognized international norm. And that's what the Biden administration has done so far.
Jon, you know as well as anyone that the cyber field is constantly evolving. What will it take from countries, multinationals, and other civil society actors to build sustainable norms and protect against future cyber attacks?
So I'm not very optimistic, to be honest. So I want to deliver that tough news up front. There's two ways that you can try to get a handle on these cyber attacks. You can look externally at the threat in other countries and internally at your own defenses and posture. Now, externally, Laura, you asked about norms and diplomacy. And I just have to be candid here that the international norms process has really not accomplished much. And a lot of people think of it as kind of in a limbo state right now, particularly with countries like Russia and China. They just have very, very different views and interests on these topics. So then that shifts you from a norms framework to more of a deterrence framework. How can we simply get bad actors to not do the things that they're doing? And this too is very, very difficult because the bad actors, whether they're criminals or states, have really entrenched reasons for doing what they're doing. And the United States and other countries don't always have huge leverage points that haven't already been tried to deter this sort of activity. That then takes you to a disruption strategy. Can we simply hack the hackers or sanction and prosecute them in some ways that would make their lives more difficult? That's effectively what a lot of US cyber policy involves. And that helps. You have to do it. It's never going to stop the activity, but it can gum up the works and marginally decrease it. So none of the external things are really going to be game changers. That means that ultimately we need to look at home. We need to look at our own cyber defenses, which is a very difficult problem considering the number of stakeholders involved, the vast number of private sector actors, which we've talked about, that are owning and operating this critical infrastructure. And the real game ultimately is not in defense, but also in resilience, ensuring that we as a society can tolerate a cyber attack, an information operation, any kind of disruptive digital event. We need to have the economic, the technological, and the political buffers in place so that when an inevitable shock to the system occurs, we can soldier on. That's the real game, and that's where I hope policy can focus in the future.
Thanks for joining us, Jon.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Usually at this point in the pod, I say, till next time. But this is actually my last episode of The World Impact. I'm excited to hand it over to our new host, Doug Farrar. Doug, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Well, in the early part of my career, I was a policy and communications advisor in the U.S. Congress. Despite the long hours and the low pay, I love being a civil servant because I got a really good look at how the sausage gets made in Washington. I've always loved the way foreign policy in Washington works or doesn't work, and I'm looking forward to introducing and reacquainting listeners with the brightest thinkers and sharpest journalists in the business.
And what issues are you most excited to unpack on the pod?
Well, there are so many interesting topics to cover in global affairs. I mean, what are we going to do about cybersecurity when a Russian-based hacker gang can empty every gas station in North Carolina with a few strokes of a keyboard? And 2 decades after some believe we reached the end of history, great power competition is back in vogue and the future of democracy is under serious threat.
A lot to cover, and in me, you will have one more listener. Wish you well, Doug. Excited to hear the pod.
Thanks so much, Laura. I'm looking forward to it.
Thank you for listening to The World Impact, produced by the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. We are grateful for your listen and eager for your feedback. We welcome your emails at podcasts@ceip.org. And please rate and review us on iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. You can find me, Laura Lucas Magnuson, on Twitter @Laura L. Magnuson. These discussions are made possible by our wonderful team behind the pod. Our audio engineer is Tim Martin, and our executive producer is Cliff Jayapranada. We'll see you next time.